The Arizona Territory in the late 1860s was a land carved by a harsh god, a place of sharp edges and stark truths. By day, the sun was a hammer, beating the life out of anything that couldn't find shade. By night, the land gave up its heat to a sky so vast and clear, it felt like a cold, dark ocean. The stars weren't just lights, they were a spill of diamond dust, close enough to touch, yet impossibly far. This was a land that didn't care for a man's dreams, only for his grit. It was home to the Apache, who knew its secrets, and to the white settlers, who tried to tame it. It was a place of cowboys driving cattle, their faces leathered by dust and sun, and bounty hunters who tracked men for coin, their eyes as hard as the stones they slept on. It was a frontier, and on the frontier, life and death were neighbors who often visited without knocking. Tonight, the wind was a lonely spirit, whispering through the canyons and kicking up dust devils that danced like ghosts in the moonlight. It carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. For Chayton, this wind was an old song. He moved through the scrubland with a silence that was part of the night itself. His moccasins made no sound on the packed earth. His eyes, accustomed to the deep shadows and pale light, missed nothing. He was a Chiricahua Apache, a warrior, a brave, as the white men called them, but the title felt heavy these days, like a winter cloak worn in the summer heat. He was young, but the wars had aged him. He had fought the asterisk into asterisk, the White Eyes, whose blue-coated soldiers marched in straight lines, their rifles spitting fire that could kill a man from a distance a bow could never reach. He had fought the Pima and the Comanche, rival tribes in a timeless struggle for water, for hunting grounds, for honor. He had seen friends fall, their lifeblood sinking into the unforgiving dust. He had felt the fire of battle in his own veins, the cold rage that made a man forget fear. He had survived. But survival had a cost. It had hollowed out a space inside him where a desire for peace had taken root, a fragile desert flower growing in the crack of a warrior's heart. His patrol tonight was a duty, but also a relief. It was a chance to be alone with the land, away from the worried eyes of the elders and the restless energy of the other young warriors in his band. They saw the world in stark colors, Apache an enemy, survival and extinction. Chayton saw the gray shadows in between. He saw the weariness in his people's faces, the slow shrinking of their world as the iron rails of the white man's railroad crept ever closer. A serpent strangling the life from the plains. He felt the pull of tradition, the weight of his ancestors' honor. But he also felt the pull of a future he could not yet see, a future where the killing might finally stop. He paused atop a low mesa, his silhouette a part of the jagged horizon, his senses, honed by a lifetime of survival, reached out into the night, the whisper of the wind, the skittering of a lizard over rock, the steady, immense silence of the desert, and then something else. A sound. It was faint, carried on a gust of wind, and it did not belong. It wasn't the cry of a night bird or the whimper of a coyote pup. It was softer, more fragile, a sound of pure misery. He tilted his head, listening, his body perfectly still. The sound came again, a choked sob that was almost swallowed by the wind. It came from a small, sheltered arroyo below, a dry wash carved by flash floods that came and went with the seasons. Caution took over. It could be a trap. The white men were full of tricks. Or perhaps a spirit, a asterisk, chindi asterisk, a ghost of someone who had died in this lonely place. His hand rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His bow was slung over his shoulder, a silent and deadly companion. He moved from the mesa's edge, circling down, using the rocks and twisted juniper trees as cover. He flowed over the terrain, a predator in his own land, his steps as sure and silent as a mountain lion's. As he drew closer, the sound became clearer. It was the sound of a woman weeping, a raw, hopeless sound that spoke of shattered worlds and absolute despair. He peered over a cluster of boulders. In the center of the arroyo, bathed in the cold, ethereal light of the stars, was a pale form. His breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, a white woman, and she was completely unclothed, her body curled into a desperate ball against the chilling desert air. Her long, dark hair was matted with dirt and tangled around her shoulders, a dark spill against the pallor of her skin. She was shivering violently, her limbs trembling not just from the cold, but from a terror that seemed to radiate from her very being. Chaitin froze, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting instincts. The warrior in him saw an enemy, a white-eye, one of the people who had driven his own from their ancestral lands, who saw his kind as savages to be hunted and exterminated. Every lesson from his elders, every scar on his body, screamed at him to turn away, to leave her to the desert. The desert was impartial. It would claim her by morning, and it would be one less enemy in the world. To help her was to invite danger. To bring her back to his people would be an act of madness, an invitation for accusations of betrayal. They would say she was a spy, or that he had lost his mind. But the man in him, the part that yearned for something beyond the endless cycle of violence, saw something else. He saw not an enemy, but a human being, stripped of everything: her clothes, her dignity, her hope. She was as vulnerable as a newborn fawn, and the desert night was a wolf circling closer. To leave her here was not the act of a warrior. It was the act of a coward. It was a cruelty his own spirit could not bear. His honor as an Apache was rooted in strength, but also in a deeper understanding of the balance of life. The Great Spirit did not make life simply to be thrown away. The struggle within him was a silent, raging battle. His hand, which had been resting on his knife, fell to his side. He watched her for a long moment, the sound of her quiet, desperate sobs tearing at the fragile peace he had sought. He saw the faint moonlight trace the curve of her spine, the sharp angle of her shoulder blades. He saw the bruises that marred her skin, dark smudges of violence against its fairness. She was not a threat. She was a victim. Someone had done this to her. He made his decision. With slow, deliberate movements, he unslung the heavy buffalo hide cloak from his shoulders. It was his warmth, his shelter, his bed in the wilderness. It smelled of wood smoke, of pine, and of the man who wore it. He stepped out from behind the rocks, his approach measured, announcing his presence without a word. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide and luminous with terror in the starlight, fixed on him. A small, horrified gasp escaped her lips. She tried to scramble backward, to cover herself with her hands, a futile gesture of modesty in the face of absolute vulnerability. She saw a shadow detach itself from the other shadows, a tall figure of a man with long, black hair and skin the color of the earth. She saw the glint of a knife at his belt, the powerful line of his shoulders. She saw an Apache warrior, the boogeyman from the stories told around settler campfires, the savage of her deepest fears. Chaitin stopped a few paces from her, holding the heavy cloak out. He didn't speak. The Apache way was to let action speak first. Words could be lies, but a gesture of warmth in the cold night was a truth that needed no translation. He saw the fear in her eyes, a raw and primal thing, and he understood it. He was her enemy, but tonight he refused to be. He took another slow step forward and gently laid the buffalo hide over her trembling form. The warmth of it was a shock, a sudden, heavy comfort that seemed to seep straight into her bones. It smelled alien, of smoke and leather and wildness, but it was warmth. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a sliver of heat began to push back against the relentless, invasive cold. She instinctively clutched the edges of the hide, pulling it tighter around herself, the rough fur soft against her bare skin. He backed away, giving her space, and turned his attention to the practicalities of survival. He gathered dry brush and twigs with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. With a flint and steel, He struck a spark, nursing the tiny ember into a flame, and soon a small, clean fire was crackling in the arroyo, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness and painting dancing orange shadows on the rock walls. Eliza Monroe watched him from the cocoon of the hide. Her mind was a fractured landscape of horror. She remembered the attack on their wagon, the sudden, terrifying thunder of hooves, the shouting, the splintering of wood, the face of her father, grim and determined, as he raised his rifle, the scream of her mother, and then a brutal, terrifying chaos. Men with cruel faces and crueler laughter, their hands grabbing, tearing. She had run. She didn't know how. She had scrambled out of the back of the overturned wagon and fled into the night, the sounds of destruction fading behind her as she ran blindly, barefoot, into the thorny, unforgiving wilderness. She had run until her lungs burned and her feet were raw, until she had finally collapsed here, in this wash, her energy gone, her hope a dying ember. She had lain there, waiting for the cold or the predators to take her, lost in a fog of shock and grief. And then he had appeared, an Apache. Her terror had been absolute, a final, searing wave of despair. She had expected a knife, a brutal end to her suffering. Instead, she had been given a cloak. She had been given a fire. Chayton moved to the far side of the fire, settling on his haunches. He kept his back partially to her, a deliberate gesture of respect for her state. His gaze fixed on the flames. He had a canteen, and he held it out, not approaching, but placing it on a flat rock between them, an offering. For a long while, they sat in silence, separated by the flickering fire and a chasm of culture, history, and fear. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the lonely cry of the wind. Eliza's shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. The man had not hurt her. He had not spoken a word. He had simply saved her from freezing to death. The initial conflict in Chayton's mind had not vanished. It had simply settled, a heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. He had made a choice for the night, an act of mercy. But the dawn would bring a new sun, and with it, a new set of impossible questions. He could not leave her. He could not take her with him. Every path seemed to lead to disaster. He had taken a stranger under his cloak, a woman from the world that was destroying his own. She was a secret born of starlight and desperation, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the desert wind, that this single act, this simple gesture of humanity, was about to unravel his entire world. He had found her, a lost soul under the stars, and in doing so, he may have just become lost himself. Dawn broke across the Arizona desert not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, unforgiving line of light that sliced the darkness from the sky. The horizon bled from indigo to a fierce, fiery orange, and the stars that had been Eliza's only companions faded into the vast blue above. The fire had dwindled to a pile of glowing embers, casting a weak, pulsing warmth. Chayton had not slept. He had remained a stoic guardian on the far side of the fire, a figure carved from the night's shadows, his eyes ever watchful. He knew this arroyo was too exposed. With the sun came the scavengers, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. They needed a better place, a hidden place. He rose with the fluid grace of a man who was as much a part of this landscape as the saguaro cactus. He added a few pieces of dried mesquite to the embers, coaxing the fire back to life. The woman, Eliza, was still asleep, huddled deep within his buffalo cloak, her breathing shallow but steady. In the growing light, he could see the exhaustion etched on her face, the dark smudges like bruises beneath her closed eyes. He saw the sharp line of her cheekbone, the delicate curve of her jaw. She looked fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain dropped in a rock quarry. Leaving her in the relative safety of the fire's circle, he scaled the side of the arroyo. His eyes scanned the terrain, reading the language of the land. He was looking for a place his people used when they needed to disappear: a shallow cave, a deep rock overhang, a place shielded from the sky and the casual glance of a passing rider. A half-mile away, nestled in a jumble of red rock formations, he found it: a wind-hollowed cave, no bigger than a bear's den, its entrance screened by a thicket of hardy desert shrubs. It was perfect. Survival was a rhythm of relentless needs. The first was shelter. The second was water. He knew of a seep not far from the cave, a place where water wept slowly from the rock, collecting in a small stone basin. He filled his canteen before moving on to the third need: food. He unslung his bow, knocking an arrow without conscious thought. The hunt did not take long. A jackrabbit, its long ears twitching as it nibbled on sparse grasses, made the fatal mistake of freezing for a moment too long. Chaitin's arrow was a silent whisper, a flicker of motion, and the hunt was over. He had provided. When he returned, Eliza was awake. She was sitting up, the buffalo hide clutched so tightly around her neck it was a wonder she could breathe. Her eyes, wide and filled with a hunted animal fear, followed his every move. The morning light cruelly exposed her situation, stripping away the soft anonymity of the night. The shame was a hot flush on her cheeks. She was painfully aware of her bareness beneath the heavy fur, of the dirt on her skin, of the tangled, wild mess of her hair. Chaitin ignored her stare, his focus absolute. He set down the rabbit and the full canteen, then skillfully set about preparing the meat. His hands were deft and sure, his knife moving with a practiced efficiency that was both fascinating and terrifying to watch. He was all economy of motion, a man who wasted nothing, not a movement, not a thought. Eliza watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the reality of her situation. She was utterly dependent on a man who, by all rights, should be her mortal enemy. He was a savage, the story said, but the savage had brought her warmth, water, and now food. The savage had kept watch over her all night. He cooked the rabbit over the fire, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air, stirring a fierce, gnawing hunger in Eliza's belly. When it was done, he took a piece for himself and pushed the rest toward her on a flat stone. He did not speak. His eyes met hers for a brief second, and in their dark depths, she saw not cruelty or menace, but a calm, steady solemnity. Hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and took a piece. The meat was hot, savory, and the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate ravenously, the primal need for sustenance overriding her fear and shame. As she ate, she felt a small measure of strength return to her limbs. It was the first step back toward being a person and not just a victim. When they had finished, Chaitin extinguished the fire, scattering the ashes until no trace remained. He gestured toward the arroyo wall. "We go," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, the English words spoken with a heavy accent, as if they were unfamiliar stones in his mouth. Eliza clutched the cloak tighter. Go where the thought of moving, of being exposed under the vast, open sky, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. He seemed to understand. He turned and picked up the rabbit's hide he had so carefully removed. It was small, but it was something from a pouch at his side. He produced a length of sinew and an awl. With the same focused intensity, he punched holes in the hide and threaded the sinew through, fashioning a crude, makeshift covering, a simple tunic that could be tied at her shoulders and waist. He placed it on the rock beside her, along with a small deerskin loincloth from his own sparse pack. Then, without a word, he turned his back to her, walking a dozen paces away to stare out at the desert, granting her a privacy that was the greatest courtesy he could offer. Tears pricked Eliza's eyes. This simple act of decency, of understanding her shame, moved her more than the fire or the food. It was a recognition of her humanity. Biting her lip, she quickly shed the heavy buffalo cloak and slipped on the makeshift garments. The rabbit hide was rough against her skin and barely covered her, but it was a shield, a barrier between her and the world. It was a start. When she was done, she wrapped the massive buffalo hide back around her shoulders, a cloak of protection and a symbol of her strange salvation. "I am ready," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He led her to the hidden cave. The walk was an agony for her bruised, bare feet, but she did not complain. The cave was small and dark, but it was shelter. It felt safe, a womb in the heart of the rock. Inside, he laid down a spare blanket he carried in his roll. He gave her the canteen. "Stay," he commanded, his meaning clear. "Do not leave." He disappeared, and Eliza was left alone with the silence and her thoughts. He returned near dusk with a handful of roots and another rabbit. They shared another silent meal as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of purple and rose. As darkness fell and the stars once more glittered to life, the reality of their pact began to take shape in the cool night air. The Apache brave had discovered an unclothed woman under the stars, and she had become his midnight secret. The thought settled in Chayton's mind, not as a poetic notion, but as a heavy, undeniable fact. She was a life he had saved, and therefore a life that now belonged to him to protect. She was a secret that could get them both killed. That night, Eliza found her voice. The immediate terror had receded, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed understanding of her predicament. And his, "They will look for me," she said, her voice stronger now. She sat across the small, carefully shielded fire he had built at the cave's mouth. Chayton looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Who? The men who attacked our wagon." The words were hard to say, each one a bitter stone in her throat. "I saw their faces. I am a witness." She paused, gathering her courage. "And my people will look for me too. They will send soldiers." Chayton nodded slowly. He knew this. The white man's world would not simply forget one of its own. "If they find me here, with you..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He finished it for her, his voice flat. "They will kill me." "Yes," she whispered. "And if your people find me here, what will they do?" He did not have to answer. The grim set of his jaw was answer enough. They would see her as a contaminant, a bad omen, a white woman who had ensnared one of their warriors. His life would be forfeit for his betrayal. A desperate urgency filled her. He had saved her, and she had brought a death sentence to his door. "You cannot take me to a fort," she said, her thoughts racing. "And you cannot take me to your people. No one can know I am alive. No one can know you found me." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "If word gets out, for me, it will be a life of shame. They will say I am ruined, that I was..." With the Apache, the shame was a palpable thing, a custom as rigid and cruel as any law. But for you, it is death, from your people or mine. It doesn't matter. They will hunt you down. Chayton stared into the fire. She was right. He was caught between two worlds, and this woman was the fulcrum upon which his life now balanced. He had known this from the moment he had laid his cloak over her shoulders. Her words only gave voice to the truth that had been haunting him for the past day and night. "I must be a secret," Eliza said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A ghost. Let the world think I died in the desert. It is the only way for either of us to survive." He looked up from the flames, his dark eyes meeting hers. He saw the intelligence there, the fierce will to live that had propelled her through the wilderness. She understood the stakes as well as he did. She was not just a fragile victim. She was a survivor. Thinking, planning. A silent understanding passed between them, as clear as any spoken vow. It was a pact forged in shared desperation, a fragile alliance against the entire world. He gave a single, slow nod. From that moment on, she was no longer just the white woman he had found. She was his responsibility, his burden, his secret. He was Chayton, the Apache warrior, and she was Eliza Monroe, the ghost of the desert, and together, in the vast and indifferent wilderness of the Arizona Territory, they would have to find a way to live with the secret born under the midnight stars. The days that followed bled into a timeless rhythm of survival, dictated by the sun and the thirst of the land. The small cave had been a sanctuary, but it was also a trap. Chayton knew that to stay in one place was to be found. They had to move, to become as transient as the desert wind. Their journey was not a straight line on a map, but a wandering, serpentine path through the harshest and most forgotten parts of the territory. They followed the high ridges where the air was thin and the views were long, and they descended into the winding, sun-scorched canyons where their passage would leave little trace. For Eliza, it was an education in a world she never knew existed. The civilized life of tidy schedules and soft beds was a distant, dreamlike memory. Now, life was measured in fundamentals: the distance to the next water source, the remaining handful of ground corn in Chayton's pouch, the integrity of the makeshift sandals he had fashioned for her from cured hide every morning. She woke with her muscles screaming in protest, her skin burned by the sun and scratched by thorns. Every day was a battle against the elements, a grueling test of will. Yet, in the crucible of this hardship, something began to change. The rigid barrier of fear and mistrust that had separated them began to crack, eroded by the constant, shared struggle for life. The space between them, once a chasm, was now filled with small, unspoken moments that wove a thread of connection. It began with fire. Chayton's flint and steel were precious, so one evening he set out to teach her the Apache way. He fashioned a drill from a stalk of yucca and a baseboard of soft cottonwood root. He showed her how to hold it, how to apply pressure and spin it with a bow made from a bent branch and a leather thong. Her first attempts were clumsy, frustrating. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, grew raw and blistered. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she cried out in frustration as the drill skittered uselessly off the board. Chayton watched, his face impassive, but he did not mock her. He simply adjusted her grip, corrected the angle of the bow, and grunted a single word of encouragement. Again. She tried again, and again. Finally, as dusk settled and her arms felt ready to fall off, a tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the board. A faint, red glow appeared, with the gentleness of a man handling a newborn bird. Chayton transferred the ember to a small bundle of tinder and blew on it softly. A tiny flame flickered to life. Eliza stared at it, her chest heaving, a triumphant smile breaking across her chapped lips. It was the first thing she had created in this new, savage world. It was her flame. Chayton began to share his knowledge, not in lectures, but in quiet demonstrations. While they walked, he would stop and point to the ground. Asterisk masi asterisk, he'd say, pointing to the delicate, cloven tracks of a deer. Then he'd point to a different set of prints, larger, with a clear mark of claws. Asterisk enda-e asterisk, mountain lion. His world was a book, and she was slowly learning to read its pages. She learned that the direction a flower faced could hint at the time of day, that the flight of bees could lead to water, that the silver-leafed jojoba bush held nuts that could soothe a hungry stomach. In return, she offered him pieces of her own world. In the evenings, huddled by the small, smokeless fires he built in the shelter of rock overhangs, the immense silence would press in on them. To fill it, she began to talk. She told him about her home in Ohio, a place of green hills and gentle rains so different from this stark, red land it might as well have been the moon. She told him about her father, a stern but loving man who had sold their farm to chase the dream of an orange grove in California. She described her mother, who played the violin and could make a garden grow anywhere. She would have loved the wildflowers here, Eliza said one night, her voice soft with memory. She saw beauty in everything. Chayton listened, his gaze fixed on the fire, He rarely spoke, but he listened with an intensity that made her feel heard, truly heard, for the first time since her world had been shattered. He was a vessel for her grief, absorbing it into his own vast silence. As she spoke, the phantom of prejudice that had haunted her began to fade. The image of the savage from lurid dime novels and campfire tales could not survive in the presence of the man before her. The man who moved with the quiet grace of a hunting cat, whose eyes missed nothing, who could read the land like a scholar reads a book, the man who had patiently taught her to make fire, who shared his last piece of jerky without a second thought, and who still, after all these weeks, turned his back to give her privacy whenever she needed it. Her internal world was in turmoil. Everything she had been taught to believe about his people was a lie. The savage was the man who had attacked her wagon, the man who had saved her, who was saving her still every single day, was simply Chaitin. His own conflict was a quieter, deeper thing. He was a warrior of the Chiricahua. His life was sworn to his people. Every day he spent with this white woman was a day stolen from his duties, a step further down a path of dishonor. Some days, they would crest a ridge and he would see a thin plume of smoke miles to the north, the signal of a hunting party, perhaps his own band. A sharp, painful longing would pierce him. He belonged there, with them. He should be guarding their camp, hunting for their elders, fighting for their future. Instead, he was here, guarding this woman. He would watch her as she slept, the firelight softening the hard lines of fear and grief on her face, and a fierce, protective instinct would rise in him, so powerful it eclipsed all other thoughts. It was more than a sense of responsibility for a life he had saved. It was something more personal, more dangerous. He was bound to her, not by duty, but by a thread he could not see and did not understand. He was betraying his ancestors. And yet, the thought of leaving her to fend for herself was an even greater betrayal of the man he was becoming. The fragile peace of their nomadic existence was shattered on an afternoon when the sky was a sheet of hot, white steel. Chaitin had left Eliza in the shade of a shallow canyon while he scouted ahead. He moved with his usual silence, but his senses were on high alert. Something felt wrong. The air was too still. The birds were too quiet. He found the tracks near a dry riverbed. 4 horses shod with iron, the mark of white men. The riders were heavy-handed, their horses leaving deep, careless prints in the sand. Amateurs, but they were armed. He found a spent rifle cartridge, its brass glinting in the sun. Further on, he found the stub of a cheroot cigar, its smell still faint on the air. It was the same brand the leader of the bandits who had attacked Eliza's wagon had been smoking. Chaitin's blood ran cold. They weren't just wandering, they were searching. The tracks were moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, sweeping back and forth across the terrain. They were hunting for her, for the one witness they had let escape. He circled back, his movements now urgent. A predator who has sensed the approach of a rival pack. He reached the canyon where he'd left Eliza and found her dozing in the shade, her face relaxed in sleep. For a moment, he hesitated, watching her. In sleep, she looked younger. The weight of her trauma momentarily lifted. The fierce protectiveness surged within him. A hot, angry fire. These men, these Bike Galkii, asterisk the ones without honor, would not touch her. He knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. Eliza's eyes flew open, wide with alarm. She saw the look on his face, the hard set of his jaw. The cold fire in his eyes and the sleep vanished, replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline. She had never seen him look like this. "What is it?" she whispered, sitting up. Chaitin didn't waste words. Men, 4 of them. He held up 4 fingers to be sure she understood. "They look for you." The color drained from Eliza's face. The past, which she had managed to hold at bay through the sheer effort of daily survival, came rushing back in a tidal wave of terror. The cruel faces, the brutal laughter, the memory of their hands on her. She began to tremble. "We move," Chayton said, his voice a low, urgent command. He was already gathering their meager supplies, the water skin, the blankets, the small pouch of provisions. Now, into the mountains. They will not follow us there. There was no time for questions, no time for fear. The immediate, tangible threat of discovery eclipsed everything else. The slow, patient rhythm of their journey was over. Now, it was a flight. The bandits were the wolves, and they were the prey. As Chayton led her out of the canyon, not back the way they came, but up a steep, treacherous rockfall that led to the high country, Eliza looked back one last time at the deceptively peaceful desert floor. The fire that had been kindled between them, the small, flickering flame of trust and understanding, was now threatened by the howling winds of a long, dark night. And in Chayton's eyes, she saw not only the focus of a warrior, but the grim resolve of a man protecting something far more precious than just his own life. The high country was a brutal refuge. They climbed into a world of fractured rock and wind-stunted pines, a landscape that fought them for every foot of elevation. The air grew thin and cold, and the pursuit of the bandits fell away behind them, their horses unable to navigate the treacherous terrain. But safety from one enemy only delivered them to another, the slow, grinding threat of starvation and exposure. Eliza's strength, so painstakingly rebuilt in the desert, was failing. A fever took hold of her one night, leaving her shivering uncontrollably despite the roaring fire Chayton built. He watched her tossing in a fitful sleep, her face pale in the firelight. And he knew his choices had run out. He could not keep her alive up here alone. The mountain passes would soon be choked with snow. They were trapped. There was only one place left to go, a place he had avoided with every fiber of his being, a sanctuary that would likely prove to be their most dangerous trial yet. His home, the hidden rancheria of his people. It was a desperate gamble, an act that violated a dozen tribal laws and 1,000 years of ingrained suspicion. But looking at Eliza's fragile form, he knew it was the only gamble he had left to play. When her fever broke, he told her, "We go to my people." Fear, stark and immediate, flashed in her eyes. "But you said—" "It is the only way," he cut in, his voice grim. "You will die here. I will not let that happen." Their arrival at the Chiricahua camp was met with a sudden, profound silence. The village was nestled in a high mountain valley, a place of impossible beauty, shielded by sheer cliffs and a dense forest of aspen and pine. Dozens of dome-shaped wickiups, structures of bent branches covered in hides and brush, were scattered amongst the trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Children, who had been laughing and playing a moment before, froze and stared with wide, dark eyes. Women grinding corn on flat stones looked up, their movements ceasing. Warriors, lean and hard as the mountains themselves, materialized from the shadows, their hands resting on the knives at their belts. Their eyes were not on Chayton, they were on Eliza. They looked at her tattered, makeshift clothes, her pale skin, and the terror she could not hide. Their expressions ranged from cold curiosity to outright hostility. She was an alien creature, a contamination, a living symbol of the world that was relentlessly trying to exterminate them. An old man emerged from the largest wickiup. His face was a roadmap of 100 hard years, his long, gray hair tied back with a simple leather band. This was Noche, the chief, a man whose wisdom was matched only by his weariness of war. He did not speak. He simply waited, his gaze heavy with a weary disappointment that was worse than any anger. Chayton walked forward, placing himself between Eliza and the hostile stares of his people. He stood before his chief and began to speak in the flowing, guttural language of the Apache. "I have brought a stranger to our home," he began, his voice clear and steady, though every warrior there could see the tension in his shoulders. A younger warrior named Jolon, his face scarred and his eyes burning with a zealot's fire, stepped forward. "You have brought an enemy." Jolon spat. A white eye. "Have you forgotten the soldiers at Apache Pass? Have you forgotten the sickness they bring? She is a spy. Or worse, a curse brought upon us for your weakness." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I have not forgotten," Chaitin replied, his voice rising to meet the challenge. "I carry the memory of our dead every day. I also carry the honor of a Kirikahua warrior. I found this woman alone in the desert. She had been left to the coyotes, stripped of everything. Was I to leave her there? Is that the honor of our people now, to leave even a helpless enemy to die a coward's death?" Noche's eyes remained on Chaitin, unblinking. "Humanity is a virtue, Chaitin, but it is a virtue we can no longer afford. Our world is shrinking, our children are hungry. One white woman is a seed from which a forest of blue-coated soldiers can grow." "She is not a threat," Chaitin insisted. "She is a witness. The men who did this to her and her family are the same kind of men who hunt us. They are bandits, murderers. She knows their faces. This is not about white or Apache. This is about men of honor against those who have none." "Honor will not stop a bullet," Jolan sneered. "He is bewitched by her. Can you not see it? He has put this woman before his people." The debate raged, a fire of words in the center of the camp. Chaitin stood his ground, arguing not from a place of love for the whites, but from a place of personal integrity and Apache principle. He had taken responsibility for her life, and he would not abandon it. Finally, Noche raised a hand, and silence fell. He looked from Chaitin's defiant face to Eliza's terrified one. "You have placed us all in danger." "Chaitin," the old chief said, his voice heavy with finality, "the council does not approve, but you are a valued warrior, and your honor has never been in question before this day. The woman may stay." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled Chaitin's knees washed over him. "But she is your shadow," Noche continued, his voice as cold as a mountain spring. "She is your responsibility. She will live apart, on the edge of the camp. She will not speak to us, and we will not speak to her. And if any trouble comes to this village because of her, if one soldier, one tracker, one sign of the white man's world follows you here, you will both pay the price, not with exile, but with your lives." The verdict hung in the air, a double-edged sword. They were safe, for now, but they were prisoners, living under a death sentence. Eliza was given a small, empty wickiup at the far edge of the camp, near the scree slope of the canyon wall. It was a place of exile, a visible symbol of her otherness. For days, she lived in a state of profound and terrifying isolation. When she stepped outside, conversations would cease. The other women would turn their backs, pulling their children close. The warriors looked through her as if she were a ghost, their faces masks of stone. The loneliness was a physical weight, more crushing than the desert sun. She was surrounded by people, yet had never felt more alone. Chaitin was her only link to sanity. He brought her food each evening, his presence a silent comfort in the oppressive hostility. But he could not stay. He had his own duties, and his association with her had already put him on the outside of his own tribe. Eliza knew she could not simply hide and waste away. She was a survivor. She began to watch the women. She saw the rhythm of their lives, the endless back-breaking work that sustained the camp. She watched them scrape and cure hides, weave intricate baskets from yucca fibers, and grind corn for hours on end to make flour for flatbread. One afternoon, she saw an old woman, a widow named Tiana, whose face was as kind as it was weathered, struggling to lift a heavy basket of corn. Without thinking, Eliza rushed forward and took one side of the basket. Tiana looked at her, startled, her first instinct to pull away. But she saw the genuine offer in Eliza's eyes. She saw not the white invader, but another woman, offering to share a burden. Tiana gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Together, they carried the basket to the grinding stones. It was a beginning, a crack in the wall of ice. Eliza began to tentatively offer her help. She was clumsy at first, her hands unskilled in their tasks, but she was persistent. She learned to grind corn until her shoulders ached, to gather firewood, to sort wild herbs. She did not speak their language, and they did not speak hers. But the shared language of work began to build a fragile bridge. They did not accept her. Not yet, but some of the women began to see her not as a threat, but as a quiet, sad creature who was trying to earn her keep. One night, the weight of it all became too much for her. The fear, the isolation, the impossible tangle of her feelings for the man who was both her savior and her jailer. Chayton came to her wickiup after the village had fallen asleep, the moonlight casting long shadows through the pines. He brought a piece of roasted venison. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the night enclosing them in a private world. "I had a dream last night," Eliza said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Chayton looked at her, waiting. "We were back in the desert," she said, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the mountains against the starry sky. "It was just us. There were no bandits, no soldiers, no Apache. The whole world was empty, except for us and the stars." She took a shaky breath. "I wasn't afraid. And you weren't a warrior. And I wasn't a white woman. We were just a man and a woman." She turned to look at him, her eyes luminous in the faint starlight that filtered through the wickiup's opening. "In my dream," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion, "I was free to love you, and there was nothing to stop me." The words hung in the small space between them, more intimate and revealing than any touch. They were an admission of a truth that had grown silently in the wilderness, a truth that was beautiful and utterly impossible. Chayton was completely still, his stoic mask unreadable. The confession she had made was a dream he had not dared to allow himself. He saw her not as a burden or a responsibility, but as the other half of a soul he hadn't known was missing. In a world that demanded he hate her, his heart had committed the ultimate treason. Slowly, as if breaking a spell, he reached across the small space and gently touched her cheek. His calloused fingers were surprisingly soft against her skin. It was a simple gesture, fleeting and light. But it was an answer. It was an admission. It was a promise of a future that could never be, in the heart of his hostile world, under the silent watch of his people. Her impossible dream had just become his own. The weeks that followed Eliza's confession were a time of fragile, stolen moments. A shared glance across the bustling camp, a brief touch of hands as Chayton passed her a water skin, a quiet conversation in the deep of night when the rest of the village slept. Their impossible dream was a secret garden they tended in the heart of a hostile land. A tense routine had settled over the rancheria. The warriors hunted and patrolled. The women worked, and Eliza, through her quiet persistence, had carved out a small, tolerated space for herself. The stairs were still cold, but the open hostility had softened to a wary truce. It was a false peace, a thin layer of ice over a raging river, and they all knew it. Chayton spent his days with his duties, but his thoughts were never far from her. He was training a new bow with his closest friend, a lanky, good-humored warrior named Tan. They had grown up together, hunted together, and fought side by side in a dozen skirmishes. "You look at the white woman with the eyes of a man looking at the horizon," Tan said one afternoon, not with accusation, but with a quiet concern. "You look for a future that is not there." "I look at a life I saved," Chayton deflected, his voice flat. "Be careful, my friend," Tan warned softly. "A life saved can become a life owed. The debt is steeper than you think." His words were prophetic. The end of their fragile world came not from within, but from the relentless evil they had fled. It came on a hot, sleepy afternoon when the only sounds were the buzz of insects and the laughter of children. A sentry, posted high on the canyon rim, let out a single, piercing cry, a hawk's shriek of alarm that cut through the valley's peace like a knife. Instantly, the camp exploded into frantic, organized chaos. Women grabbed their children and scrambled for the safety of the caves at the base of the cliffs. Warriors erupted from their wickiups, grabbing bows, rifles, and lances. Chayton found Tan, and they shared a single, grim nod. He caught Eliza's eye across the clearing, her face a mask of pale terror. He wanted to run to her, to hide her away, but his duty was to the tribe. He pointed toward the caves, a sharp, commanding gesture. "Go stay hidden," he yelled, his voice nearly lost in the rising din. Then the bandits were upon them. They didn't use tactics or strategy. They used brute force and terror. 4 riders burst from the tree line at the mouth of the valley, their horses charging, their rifles roaring. They were the men from Eliza's nightmares, their faces contorted with cruel glee. They fired indiscriminately, their bullets tearing through the hide walls of the wickiups, kicking up dust and chaos. The Apache warriors, masters of their terrain, did not meet the charge head-on. They melted into the spaces between the wickiups, behind boulders, and into the trees. A deadly volley of arrows answered the rifle fire. One of the riders screamed and tumbled from his saddle, an arrow sprouting from his chest. But the bandits had come to do more than just kill. One of them carried a torch. He galloped past the outer ring of wickiups, leaning down to touch the flame to the dry brush and hide coverings. The structures, dried by the summer sun, went up in an instant, a whoosh of flame and oily black smoke. Fire, the great and terrible purifier, was their weapon of choice. It spread panic, choked the air, and destroyed the homes and stores of the people. From a crevice in the rocks, Eliza watched in horror. This was her fault. The nightmare she had brought to Chayton's door had finally broken it down. The air filled with a terrifying symphony of destruction, the deafening crack of rifles, the high-pitched hum of arrows, the panicked whinnying of horses, and the screams of the wounded. She saw Tiana, the old woman who had first shown her kindness, shielding 2 small children with her own body as she guided them to safety. She saw Jolon, Chayton's rival, fight with a cold, desperate fury, his hatred for her now focused on the invaders. And she saw Chayton. He moved through the chaos not like a man, but like a spirit of vengeance. He was swift, silent, and deadly. An arrow from his bow found a gunman's throat. He dropped from the roof of a wickiup onto another bandit, his knife flashing. He fought to protect the home that was in the process of rejecting him, for the people who now saw him as a traitor. He and Tan fought back to back, a seamless dance of death they had perfected over years of battle. They drove the remaining 2 riders back toward the mouth of the valley. It seemed, for a moment, that the Apaches would win, that they would repel the invaders. Then tragedy struck. The leader of the bandits, a big bearded man with eyes like chips of ice, wheeled his horse around. He fired his pistol wildly, a last act of defiance. The bullet was not aimed. It was a stray shot, a piece of random, cruel luck. It caught Tan in the side, knocking him from his feet. Chayton saw his friend fall. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The noise of the battle faded to a dull roar in his ears. He saw Tan look at him, his eyes wide with surprise, a dark stain spreading across his tunic. In that moment of distraction, the bandit leader charged, his knife held high, but Chayton's grief instantly curdled into a white-hot rage. He sidestepped the charge, grabbed the man's arm, and used his momentum to pull him from the saddle. The fight was short and brutal. It ended with Chayton's knife and the bandit's blood soaking into the sacred ground of his home. The last bandit, seeing his leader fall, fled into the wilderness. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The silence that descended was more terrible than the noise. It was filled with the crackle of burning homes and the soft, gut-wrenching sounds of weeping. The villagers emerged from their hiding places, their faces smeared with soot and tears. They saw the devastation, their homes destroyed, their winter stores turned to ash, and the bodies of their fallen scattered on the ground. They had lost 4 warriors. Tan was among them. Chayton knelt by his friend's body, his shoulders slumped, the fire of his battle rage extinguished, leaving only the cold ashes of grief. Jolan was the first to give voice to the poison that was spreading through the camp. He strode to the center of the clearing, his face a mask of fury, and pointed a trembling finger, not at Chayton, but toward the caves where Eliza was hidden. "This is the blood price of his white woman," Jolan roared, his voice cracking with grief and rage. "Tan is dead because of her. Our homes are ashes because of her. She is the bad omen we allowed to fester in our midst." The tribe, raw with pain and loss, needed a focus for their anguish. The logic was simple, brutal and absolute. They had been safe. The white woman came. Now they were burying their dead. Noche, the old chief, looked at the destruction, at the weeping widows, at the lifeless form of Tan, a warrior he had watched grow from a boy. His face, already etched with sorrow, hardened into a mask of grim duty. His promise, his death sentence, had been invoked. "Chayton," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. Chayton looked up, his eyes hollow. He saw the faces of his people, faces that had once looked at him with respect, now twisted with blame and hatred. He saw no mercy there. He rose to his feet and stood tall, ready to accept his fate. He had made a choice, and this was the consequence. "Seize him!" Noche commanded. The warriors, the very men who had just fought beside him, hesitated for only a second before moving in. They took his weapons and bound his hands tightly behind his back with leather thongs. They dragged him to the center of the ruined camp and tied him to the same post where they celebrated their victories, a place of honor that was now a pillar of shame. Eliza watched from the shadows of the cave, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob. This was her doing. Every death, every tear, every smoldering ruin was her fault. Chayton, who had saved her, protected her, and looked at her with a forbidden tenderness, was going to die, and it was all because of her. The tribe began the rituals of mourning, their sorrowful chants mixing with the muttered curses directed at the bound figure. His execution was set for dawn. There would be no trial, no debate. The evidence was written in the blood and ashes that surrounded them. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Eliza. She could run. She could slip away in the chaos and darkness and try to survive in the mountains, but that would be a coward's path. It would be a betrayal of the man who had sacrificed everything for her. It would be an acceptance of the guilt that was consuming her. No, hiding was over. The secret was out, paid for in blood. As she watched them prepare their funeral pyres, a new feeling began to burn through her despair, a fierce, desperate resolve. She was the cause of this, and she would be the one to face it. She could not let Chayton die for an act of compassion. She had brought this fire upon the village, and she would walk into it herself if she had to. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Eliza Monroe, the ghost of the desert, stepped out of the darkness of the cave and into the terrible, fire-lit judgment of the Apache people. All movement in the ruined camp ceased. The crackle of the dying fires and the low, mournful chants of the widows were the only sounds. Every head turned, and 100 pairs of hostile eyes fixed on Eliza as she walked into the center of the clearing, her small form illuminated by the flickering light of the funeral pyres. She stopped a dozen feet from the post where Chayton was bound, her chin held high, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Chayton's head snapped up. He saw her, and a fresh wave of despair, sharper and colder than any he had yet felt, washed over him. What was she doing? Her courage was magnificent, but it was the courage of a moth flying into a flame. She was offering her own life, a sacrifice that would change nothing. "Go back," he yelled, his voice a raw, desperate command in his own language. "Go back to the caves." Jolan, his face a thundercloud of hate, took a menacing step toward her. "This is a place of Apache sorrow. White woman, it is not for you. Go, before your presence defiles the spirits of our dead." Eliza ignored them both. Her eyes were fixed on one man, only Noche. She walked past Jolan as if he were a stone, stopping directly before the old chief, who watched her approach with an unreadable, stony expression. She did not know his language, but she knew the language of grief, of authority, of desperation. She would make him understand. "This is my fault," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, ringing out in the charged silence. The English words were alien here, but her tone was universal. She placed a hand on her own chest, a gesture of ownership. "My fault." She looked from the smoldering ruins of the wickiups to the shrouded bodies of the dead warriors. "These men died because of me." A growl of agreement rumbled through the assembled warriors. "The men who attacked you, the bandits, they were not looking for you," she continued, her gaze unwavering on Noche's face. "They were looking for me." She saw a flicker of something in the old chief's eyes. Not surprise, but a dawning, grim understanding. "I am a witness," Eliza said, her voice gaining strength with every word. She pointed a finger toward the darkness beyond the valley. I saw them attack my family. I saw their faces. I know their leader." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And I know where they hide." This sent a shockwave through the camp. Conversations erupted in hushed, angry Apache. Jolon scoffed loudly. A trick. A lie to save her lover's life. Eliza ignored him, her entire being focused on the chief. "Before I escaped, I was in their wagon. They were talking. They spoke of their camp, a place safe from soldiers, where they keep their stolen goods. They called it Crow's Peak. They said it was a box canyon, 2 days' ride from here, marked by 3 stone pillars that looked like a bird's claw. The detail, so specific and strange, silenced the crowd. This was not the vague pleading of a condemned woman. It was intelligence. Chayton stared at her, his mind reeling. She had never told him this. She had held this information, a final, desperate card, close to her chest. "They did not find me today." Eliza pressed on, her voice ringing with the force of irrefutable logic. "They will count their dead and know I am still alive. They will be back. For me. And they will kill anyone who stands in their way." She took a step closer to Noche, her eyes pleading but her stance defiant. "If you kill me, you silence the only person who knows their sanctuary. If you kill Chayton, you rob yourselves of the warrior you need to lead you to them. Killing us will not bring back your dead. It will not rebuild your homes. It will only leave you blind and vulnerable, waiting for the wolves to return." Noche was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes boring into hers, searching for the lie, for the trick. He saw only a desperate, terrifying sincerity. He saw a woman who had walked willingly into the heart of her enemy's camp to make her stand. "What is it you propose?" he asked, his own English perfect, a secret he had kept hidden behind his stoic, tribal facade. The revelation stunned his own people as much as it did Eliza. "Let me go," she said, her breath catching for a second at his fluency. "Let me prove I am not your enemy. Let me prove I am not a burden." She turned and pointed a trembling hand at Chayton. "Untie him. Give him back his weapons. Let us lead a war party. Let us guide you to their door. Let us help you take the vengeance you deserve." The audacity of her proposal was breathtaking. The camp erupted. Jolon was apoplectic. "Never, we will not be led by this woman. We will not trust the traitor who brought her here. It is a trap to lead our remaining warriors to their deaths." Silence. Noche's voice was the crack of a whip. He turned his full attention back to Eliza. "You ask me to trust the lives of my warriors to a white woman and a man who has betrayed his blood." "You are not trusting me," Eliza countered, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "You are using me. You are using my knowledge. What do you have to lose if we lead you to them? You can destroy them forever. If we fail, you have lost only 2 people you were going to execute at dawn anyway." Her logic was a cold, hard stone dropped into the roiling waters of their grief. It was undeniable. Noche looked at the faces of his people at the widows, their faces streaked with tears and ash, at the children, their eyes wide with fear, at his warriors, their hearts filled with a thirst for revenge. Their pain demanded an answer, a release. Vengeance was a fire that could cauterize a wound. He made his decision. He turned to his people and spoke in the Apache tongue, his voice rolling through the valley like thunder. The woman speaks with a serpent's logic, but the path she shows is one of vengeance. Jolon is right to be wary, but the spirits of our dead cry out for blood. We will use this woman. We will use her knowledge as we would use a white man's rifle, a tool of our enemy turned against them. He looked directly at Chaitin, his eyes hard as flint. You will be unbound. You will lead. You will take the woman and 5 warriors. You will lead them to this Crow's Peak. But know this. He raised his voice so all could hear. If this is a trick, if you lead our warriors into an ambush, if you fail, your people will not grant you a quick death. We will hunt you down, and your end will be a lesson sung by our children for 100 years. The woman's will be the same. The debt of blood will be paid, one way or another. He gave a sharp nod to 2 warriors, who moved forward and, with visible reluctance, cut the thongs binding Chaitin's wrists. Chaitin stumbled forward, rubbing the circulation back into his hands. He looked at Eliza, his face an unreadable mask of awe, terror, and a love so profound it was a physical pain in his chest. She had just gambled both of their lives on a piece of overheard conversation and the desperate hope that a grieving chief was a pragmatist. As the small war party prepared to leave, gathering weapons, water, and parched corn, Chaitin and Eliza found a moment of reprieve in the deep shadows behind the chief's wickiup, away from the accusing eyes of the tribe. The air was cold, carrying the stench of smoke and death. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I could not let you die," she answered simply, her voice trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. "Not for me." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her soot-stained cheeks. He looked at her as if memorizing every feature, every line. He saw not a white woman, but the soul who had dreamed of loving him under the stars, the woman who had walked into the fire for him. All the barriers between them, race, prejudice, circumstance, crumbled into dust in that moment. They were no longer an Apache warrior and a settler's daughter. They were a man and a woman, standing on the edge of the abyss, with nothing left but each other. "Eliza." He breathed her name for the first time, the sound a prayer on his lips. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and despair, of gratitude and grief. It was fierce and hungry, a confirmation of the impossible dream she had confessed to him nights before. It was the taste of smoke and tears, the feel of chapped lips and the rough stubble on his jaw. It was all the words they could not say, all the hope they did not have, poured into one frantic, heartbreaking moment. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his arms, kissing him back with a ferocity that matched his own. This was not a beginning. It was a farewell, a promise made against the overwhelming certainty of death. When they broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to outline the eastern peaks, the dawn that was meant to be his last. "Ready!" a grim voice called out. It was Jolon. Noche had sent him, a final, cruel twist of the knife. He would be one of the 5 warriors to go with them, his hatred a constant, watchful presence at their backs. Chaitin and Eliza looked at each other one last time, a universe of understanding passing between them. Then, without another word, they turned and walked out of the shadows, leading the small, grim party of warriors out of the ruined camp and into the gray, uncertain light of the new day. The 2-day journey to the place the bandits called Crow's Peak was a silent, grinding ordeal. They moved at a relentless pace, a small party of 7 ghosts against a vast, indifferent landscape. Jolon and the other 4 warriors followed Chaitin's lead, but their obedience was brittle, their suspicion a palpable force. They watched Chaitin's every move, But they watched Eliza with an even greater intensity, their eyes constantly assessing, judging, waiting for the first sign of betrayal. Eliza, for her part, focused on the memory that was their only map. She closed her eyes and replayed the rough, boastful words of the bandits in her mind. Asterisk. 2 days' ride south of the old mission ruin. Follow the dry wash until you see the 3 stone fingers. Looks like a damn crow's claw reaching for the sky. She guided them not with a compass, but with the echoes of her trauma, turning her nightmare into their weapon. Chayton was the tactical center of their grim procession. He translated Eliza's remembered words into the language of the land, choosing their path, watching for tracks. His senses stretched taut. He spoke little, the weight of his responsibility a heavy cloak on his shoulders. The kiss he had shared with Eliza felt like a brand on his soul, a moment of impossible connection that now fueled his resolve. He was no longer just fighting for his honor or his life. He was fighting for the dream she had whispered to him in the dark, a dream of a world where they could simply be a man and a woman under the stars. On the afternoon of the second day, Eliza stopped. "There," she whispered, pointing. Ahead of them, rising from the flat expanse of the desert floor, were 3 weathered stone pillars, eroded by centuries of wind into uncanny shapes. They did indeed look like the claw of some massive, carrion bird. A cold knot of fear and vindication tightened in her stomach. Her memory was true. The first part of her gamble had paid off. They took shelter in a cluster of rocks as dusk began to bleed across the sky. Chayton and 1 other warrior, a quiet man named Kenji, went ahead to scout, melting into the shadows like smoke. Jolon stayed with the others, his hand never straying far from his knife, his eyes fixed on Eliza. An hour later, Chayton and Kenji returned, their faces grim. "They are there," Chayton reported in a low voice to the assembled warriors. 7 of them, in a box canyon, just as she said. "The entrance is narrow. They are careless. They drink and laugh around a large fire. They believe we are broken." "They will learn what a broken Apache can do," Jolon snarled, his voice a low growl of anticipation. Chayton outlined the plan. It was classic Apache strategy: use the terrain, strike with surprise, and create chaos. 2 warriors, including Jolon, would climb the treacherous eastern rim of the canyon. 2 others would take the western rim. They would wait for his signal. He and Eliza would approach the canyon mouth. The key was the entrance itself. The walls were steep and littered with loose rock and scree. A carefully started rock slide would seal the trap. "The woman comes with me," Jolon questioned, his disbelief and contempt clear. "The woman is the reason we are here," Chayton said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She will have a rifle. She will stay back and provide cover. Her fight is with these men as much as ours is." He handed Eliza a rifle taken from one of the dead bandits and a small pouch of ammunition. The weapon felt heavy and alien in her hands, but she accepted it with a firm nod. Her hands did not tremble. The time for trembling was over. They moved under the cover of a moonless night, the stars a cold, glittering canopy above. The approach was agonizingly slow, each footstep placed with surgical care. When the party was in position, Chayton and Eliza crept toward the canyon mouth. They could hear the bandits now, their rough laughter and drunken singing echoing off the rock walls, a profane sound in the sacred silence of the desert night. Chayton found the place he was looking for: a steep, unstable slope of rock and shale directly above the narrow entrance. He gave a single, low whistle, the call of a night owl, the signal to his warriors on the rim. Then, using the butt of his rifle, he dislodged the first large boulder. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The single boulder crashed down, dislodging others, and in a heartbeat, the slope gave way. A thundering, grinding river of rock and dust cascaded into the canyon entrance, completely blocking the path. For a moment, there was stunned silence from within the canyon. Then, a string of curses and confused shouts, The bandits, startled from their drunken revelry, grabbed their weapons and ran toward the entrance, only to find it sealed. They were trapped. That's when the arrows began to fall. From the darkness on the canyon rim, silent, feathered shafts of death rained down on the illuminated camp. One man screamed and fell, clutching his throat. Another toppled into the fire, a shaft buried deep in his back. The Apache warriors were ghosts, firing with deadly accuracy from the shadows, their positions invisible. Eliza, her heart pounding against her ribs, took position behind a large boulder, resting the rifle on its edge. She was 100 yards from the chaos. She saw the bandits, now in a full-blown panic, firing wildly into the darkness, their bullets ricocheting uselessly off the canyon walls. They were targets in a shooting gallery. Her eyes scanned the scene, searching for one face in particular, and then she saw him, the leader, the big, bearded man who had haunted her dreams. His name was Harker. He was not panicking. He was a professional. He kicked over a barrel, taking cover behind it, and began firing with a calm, deadly precision toward the muzzle flashes on the western rim. "He is mine," Chayton's voice whispered from the darkness beside her. He had circled around, his bow in his hand. He nocked an arrow, but before he could fire, Harker moved, ducking behind another obstacle. The battle devolved into a brutal, close-quarters affair. Jolon and the others descended from the rims, their knives and tomahawks flashing, closing with the remaining terrified bandits. It was swift and merciless, but Harker and one other bandit held their ground, their backs to the canyon wall, their pistols creating a deadly field of fire. Chayton knew bows and arrows would not win this. He slung his bow over his shoulder and drew his knife. With a fierce cry, he charged, not directly at Harker, but in a zigzagging pattern, using the scattered crates and barrels as cover. Eliza watched, her breath held in a painful knot. She raised her rifle, trying to get a clear shot at the second bandit, who was providing cover for his leader. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its roar deafening. The bullet went wide, chipping rock a foot from the man's head, but it made him duck, giving Chayton the opening he needed. He closed the distance in 3 long strides and slammed into Harker. The 2 men went down in a brutal tangle of limbs. Harker was bigger and heavier, but Chayton was faster and fueled by a righteous fury. They rolled in the dust, knives flashing in the firelight. The other warriors had finished the rest of the bandits. Jolon, his face smeared with grime and sweat, turned to watch the life-or-death struggle between his rival and the bandit chief. Chayton gained the upper hand, his knife finding an opening in Harker's defense, slicing a deep gash in his arm. Harker roared in pain and fury. He was weakening. Chayton pressed his advantage, his knife at Harker's throat. "This is for my people," Chayton snarled in English. "For the homes you burned. For the friends you murdered." Harker laughed, a bloody, gurgling sound. "Your people," he spat, his eyes glittering with a strange, defiant light. "This ain't about your people, savage. This is about progress. It's about the future." "What are you talking about?" Chayton demanded, pressing the blade harder. "You think this was just a raid?" Harker gasped, a wild grin on his face. "This was a contract, a job. I was hired." The words hit Chayton like a physical blow. Hired. "A man in Prescott, a Commissioner Davies." Harker coughed, blood flecking his lips. "He wants this land. Says the railroad needs a straight path. Says the Apache are an impediment. He paid us well. Paid us to clear the impediment. Burn you out. Drive you off. Make it look like you just disappeared." The confession, so casually delivered, was monstrous. This wasn't banditry, it was a conspiracy, an officially sanctioned extermination. The revelation ignited the last of Chayton's restraint. With a cry that was equal parts grief and rage, he drove his knife home. Harker's eyes went wide, and then his body went limp. Chayton stood up, panting, his body trembling with adrenaline and hatred. The battle was won. But Harker had one last treacherous act left in him. Even as life faded, his hand, hidden beneath his body, had found the small Derringer pistol tucked in his belt. With his last ounce of strength, he fired. The shot was a muffled pop. Chayton cried out and staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face. He clutched his side, where a dark, wet stain was already spreading through his buckskin shirt. Eliza screamed his name. At that exact moment, the last remaining bandit, a man she had thought was dead, stirred. He had been playing possum. He pushed himself up, his eyes wild, and saw his leader dead and the Apache warrior wounded. He saw his chance. He raised his rifle, the barrel leveling directly at Chayton's chest. Everything slowed down. Jolon and the others were too far away. Chayton was stumbling, defenseless. Eliza didn't think. She acted. She raised her rifle again, the stock pressed hard against her shoulder. The world narrowed to the front sight, the dark shape of the bandit, and the man she loved. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, and this time her aim was true. The bandit was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible hammer, his rifle clattering to the ground. Then there was silence, a profound, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Chayton's ragged breathing as he sank to his knees. The battle was over. The secret of their enemy was revealed. But as Eliza ran toward Chayton, her heart a cold stone of terror in her chest, she knew their victory might have come at the ultimate cost. She had fired the last shot and saved his life. But the traitor's bullet had already found its mark. The world snapped back into focus with the echo of Eliza's rifle shot. For a frozen moment, no one moved. There was only the dead silence of the canyon, the flickering firelight, and the sight of Chayton on his knees, clutching his side, his lifeblood seeping between his fingers. Eliza dropped the rifle and ran, her feet slipping on the blood-soaked dust. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wound. Afraid to touch, afraid not to. Chayton, she breathed, her voice a ragged sob. His eyes, glazed with pain, found hers. He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but it was a grimace of agony. "The traitor's last bite," he gasped. Jolon was the first to reach them. He looked from the dead bandit Eliza had shot to the dead leader Harker, and then to the wounded Chayton, the hatred in his eyes, a fire that had burned so hot for so long, was gone, replaced by a complex, grudging respect. He had seen it all. He had seen this woman, this Inda asterisk, fight with the heart of a warrior. He had seen her kill to save the man he called a traitor. "We must stop the bleeding," Jolon said, his voice stripped of its usual venom. He knelt and, with a surprising gentleness, tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt, pressing it firmly against Chayton's wound. The return journey was a slow-motion nightmare. They fashioned a crude travois from branches and a blanket to carry Chayton, a painful, jolting ride that drew a constant stream of low groans from him. Eliza walked beside him, her hand never leaving his, her mind a frantic prayer. She cleaned his wound with the last of their water and packed it with the crushed leaves of a plant Tiana had once shown her, one that staunched bleeding. The other warriors, once her tormentors, now watched her with a quiet deference. She was no longer the outsider. She was their healer, their hope. When their small, battered party appeared at the mouth of the valley 2 days later, the entire village came out to meet them. A wave of gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as they saw the travois, as they saw Chayton's pale, still form. Noche pushed through the crowd, his old face a mask of grim anticipation. Jolon stepped forward to meet his chief. He was no longer the angry, resentful warrior who had left. He was a leader, his voice ringing with the authority of battle. "The bandits are no more," he announced, holding up the bloodied knife of the man Harker. The woman's words were true. She led us to their den, and we sealed them in their grave. He then told the story of the battle, his words painting a vivid picture of the ambush, of the fight in the firelight. He spoke of Chayton's courage, of his fury. And then, his voice dropping, he turned and looked directly at Eliza. The warrior Chayton was struck down by the leader's last breath. Jolon said, his voice clear for all to hear. He was defenseless. The last bandit rose to kill him. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. It was the white woman who saved him. Her rifle fired the last shot of the battle. She killed the man who would have killed Chayton. Her heart is Apache. A stunned silence fell over the tribe. They looked at Eliza, at this pale, slight woman, and saw her for the first time not as an omen or an enemy, but as a warrior in her own right. But Jolon was not finished. Their leader spoke before he died. He continued, his eyes finding Noche's. He said this was not a raid. It was a contract. A white man chief in Prescott, a Commissioner Davies, paid them to burn our homes, to drive us out, to clear the land for the Iron Road. This final revelation was the most devastating blow of all. Their tragedy was not random. It was a calculated act of war, a quiet, unofficial extermination. The knowledge unified them in their grief and their anger. In that moment, Chayton and Eliza became heroes. They were the ones who had brought back the truth. They were the ones who had delivered vengeance. Chayton was carried to the wickiup of the medicine man, and Eliza was finally, truly, allowed into the circle. The women, led by Tiana, brought her food and water. They gave her a clean deerskin dress and tended to the cuts and bruises she had earned. They spoke to her not in words, but with gentle gestures and kind eyes. She had paid a blood price, and with it, had bought her acceptance. Weeks passed, under the care of the medicine man and the constant watch of Eliza. Chayton slowly began to heal. The wound was deep, and a fever nearly took him, but he held on, his strength fueled by the sight of her face whenever he opened his eyes. The village began to rebuild. The sounds of hammers and saws replaced the sounds of weeping. They were a resilient people, and this shared victory, this shared knowledge of their true enemy, had forged them into something stronger. Yet a shadow remained. As Chayton grew stronger and began to walk through the rebuilt camp, with Eliza always by his side, they both felt it. They were heroes, yes, but they were still an anomaly. The gratitude of the tribe was real, but it could not erase the deep, ingrained truths of their world. He was Apache. She was white. Their love, which had blossomed in the secret, desperate moments of their journey, was now an open, unspoken fact, and it was a fact that had no place here. Eliza saw it in the way the young, unmarried women looked at Chayton, a mixture of awe and sorrow. He was a great warrior, a hero, but he was lost to them. She saw it in the way the elders would fall silent when she and Chayton approached. They respected her, but they did not understand how she could fit into the life of their tribe. An Apache warrior took an Apache wife. He raised Apache children. That was the way. That was the path to survival. Their love, however pure, was a threat to that path. She knew, with a certainty that broke her heart, what she had to do. Her final act of love would be to set him free. One night, when Chayton was almost fully healed, she came to him as he sat outside his wickiup, gazing at the star-filled sky. She had a small bundle with her. "I am leaving, Chayton," she said softly. He turned to her, his face instantly clouded with pain and confusion. "Leave? Where will you go? This is your home now." "No," she said, shaking her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "This is your home. I can never truly be a part of it. I see the way they look at you. You are a hero, but you are also an outcast because of me. You deserve a life here, with your people. You deserve a wife who understands your ways, who can give you children who belong to this land." "I do not want another wife," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. "I want you." "And I want you more than anything in this world," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That is why I have to go. If I stay, I will always be a wall between you and your people. I will be a constant reminder of the world that is trying to destroy you. I saved your life in that canyon. Now let me save it again, for the future." Before he could argue, she leaned in and kissed him, a deep, sorrowful kiss filled with the ache of goodbye. Then she turned and walked away, a small, resolute figure disappearing into the darkness. For a full day, Chaitan was paralyzed by grief and conflict. He looked at the faces of his people, at the mountains that had cradled him his whole life. This was everything he had ever known. To leave it was to cut out his own heart. But as he looked at the star-dusted sky that night, he knew that his heart was no longer in his chest. It had walked out of the valley with her. His home was not the ground beneath his feet. It was the woman who had dreamed of loving him. He made his choice. Before dawn, he packed a small bag, took his bow and rifle, and slipped out of the camp, following the tracks only he could see. He caught up with her 2 days later, near the border of the territory. She was sitting by a small stream, looking tired and lost, but still determined. She heard a twig snap and looked up, her eyes going wide as she saw him. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered as he approached. "You are my people now. Eliza," he said simply, stopping before her. He reached down and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "My life is with you, wherever you go." Tears streamed freely down her face, but for the first time, they were tears of joy. He had chosen her. He had given up everything for her. They stood there for a long moment, hand in hand, as the last light of day faded and the vast diamond spill of the desert sky appeared above them. The world was uncertain, their future a blank, untamed wilderness. They had no home, no tribe, nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fierce, impossible love that had survived fire and blood. But it was enough. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their story. "That night," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, certain wonder, "when you found me naked under the stars, I knew I would belong to you. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to connect with our audience, so please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Your thoughts and feelings mean a lot to us. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach even more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to give it a boost. Your support makes all the difference.